So fair. Carter's hands were still wrapped in gauze from pulling a child out of the flames when the man in the $1,000 suit told her she now belonged to him. Saving a mafia boss's son wasn't heroism, it was a debt she'd spend the rest of her life repaying. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The smoke detector's piercing shriek cut through the autumn evening air exactly as I was zipping up my daughter's jacket. Maya looked up at me with those enormous brown eyes that could convince me to buy another stuffed animal we definitely didn't have room for, completely oblivious to the alarm that had just transformed our quiet Tuesday into something else entirely. I'd lived in the Riverside apartments for 3 years, long enough to know that fire alarms usually meant someone had burned popcorn in the communal kitchen, or that Mrs. Chun on the 4th floor had gotten creative with her incense again. But this time, the acrid smell seeping under my door suggested something far more serious. At 28 years old, I'd become an expert at making split-second decisions that kept my small family afloat. When to accept the overtime shift that would mean less time with Maya but more money for her dance class. When to skip lunch so I could afford the good crayons she wanted for her art project. When to smile through exhaustion because a 6-year-old shouldn't have to carry her mother's burden. This decision took less than a heartbeat. I grabbed my emergency bag, the one I'd prepared after reading too many disaster preparedness articles during sleepless nights, scooped Maya onto my hip and headed for the stairwell. The hallway was already filling with smoke, thick gray clouds that turned the familiar corridor into something from a nightmare. Other residents were emerging from their apartments, some moving with practiced calm, others with the wide-eyed panic of people who'd never considered that fire drills might one day become reality. I kept Maya's face pressed against my shoulder, my hand cupped over her nose and mouth as we joined the stream of people heading toward the emergency exit. The heat was building. I could feel it through the walls, radiating with an intensity that made sweat break out across my skin. Despite the autumn chill that had greeted us just minutes before, we were halfway down the 3rd-floor stairwell when I heard it. A child's scream, high-pitched and terrified, cutting through the chaos with the clarity of a bell. Every maternal instinct the first possessed locked onto that sound, and I found myself turning back even as my rational mind screamed that this was insanity. Maya tightened her grip around my neck, sensing my tension, but she stayed quiet in that way she'd learned during the difficult years after her father walked out. My daughter had learned early how to be brave when I needed her to be. The scream came again, louder now, from the direction of apartment 3B. I knew that unit. The Castellanos had moved in 6 months ago, keeping to themselves in a way that spoke of deliberate privacy rather than unfriendliness. I'd seen the father occasionally, a man in his late 30s who wore suits that probably cost more than my monthly rent and moved with the kind of confident grace that suggested he was accustomed to command. His son, a boy around 4 years old, had the same dark hair and serious eyes. I'd watched him in the parking lot sometimes, the way the father would crouch down to his son's level for their conversations, the gentleness in his touch that contrasted with the hardness I sometimes glimpsed in his expression. The door to 3B stood ajar, smoke pouring through the gap like something alive and malevolent. Through the haze I could see the flicker of flames deeper in the apartment, orange and hungry, consuming everything they touched. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, to get Maya to safety, to let someone else handle this catastrophe. But that child's scream echoed in my ears, and I found myself making another split-second decision that would change everything. I set Maya down in the hallway, kneeling so we were eye to eye. Her face was streaked with tears, but she wasn't crying, wasn't making a sound. My brave, beautiful girl who'd learned too young how to be strong. Listen to me carefully, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the terror clawing at my chest. You're going to go down these stairs right now. Don't stop, don't wait for me. Go straight to Mrs. Rodriguez from 2A. You remember her? The nice lady with the cat? Maya nodded, her small hands clutching the stuffed rabbit she took everywhere. Tell her your mama is helping someone. Tell her to keep you safe until I come back. I will come back, baby, I promise. The look in my daughter's eyes nearly broke me. She was too young to understand the weight of promises made in burning buildings, too innocent to know that sometimes promises were all we had left when the world turned to ash around us. But she nodded again, squared her small shoulders, and turned toward the stairs. I watched her for 3 heartbeats, memorizing the way her dark curls bounced as she moved, the determined set of her spine that was so much like my own. Then I turned back to apartment 3B and stepped through the door into hell. The heat hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs and making my eyes water instantly. I pulled my jacket up over my nose and mouth, trying to filter the toxic air as I moved deeper into the apartment. The layout mirrored my own unit, which gave me a small advantage in the disorienting smoke. Living room to the right, kitchen straight ahead, bedrooms down the hallway to the left. The screaming was coming from one of the bedrooms, punctuated now by violent coughing that suggested time was running out faster than I'd hoped. I dropped to my hands and knees where the air was slightly clearer and crawled toward the sound. The carpet beneath my palms was hot enough to be uncomfortable, and I didn't want to think about what that meant for the structural integrity of the floor beneath. Fire safety videos I'd watched during mandatory training at my nursing assistant job ran through my head. All those statistics about how fast fire could spread, how quickly smoke could incapacitate, how many people died from inhalation rather than burns. I pushed the thoughts away and focused on moving forward, on reaching that child whose cries were growing weaker. The bedroom door was closed, which had probably saved the boy's life by limiting the oxygen feeding the fire. I reached up to test the doorknob, snatching my hand back when the metal burned my palm. Using the sleeve of my jacket as protection, I managed to turn the knob and push the door open. The scene inside made my heart drop. The boy was huddled in the corner farthest from the door, pressed against the window that overlooked the parking lot 3 stories below. His face was streaked with soot and tears, his small body shaking with each cough that racked his frame. But he was alive, conscious, and when he saw me, hope flared in those dark eyes so like his father's. I moved across the room with purpose, not giving myself time to think about how the walls around us were literally burning, how the ceiling was starting to show ominous cracks that suggested imminent collapse. The window was sealed shut, probably painted over by generations of maintenance workers who'd prioritized appearance over emergency egress. I grabbed a toy truck from the floor, heavy decast metal that felt solid in my hands, and smashed it against the window with all the strength, fear, and adrenaline could provide. The glass shattered outward, letting in a rush of blessedly cool air that also fed oxygen to the fire behind us. The boy was lighter than Maya, easier to lift despite his panic. I wrapped him in the bedspread, trying to protect him from the glass shards and the smoke as I moved back toward the door. But the hallway was worse now, completely engulfed in flames that had spread with terrifying speed. The path we'd need to take to reach the stairs was impassable, the fire creating a wall of heat that would kill us long before we made it through. For the first time since entering the apartment, real panic began to claw at my chest. I'd promised Maya I would come back. I'd promised this boy's father, in the silent way we promise strangers when we take responsibility for their loved ones, that I would save his child. The window was our only option. 3 stories up, overlooking the parking lot where emergency vehicles were starting to arrive, their lights painting the evening in shades of red and blue. I could see people gathering below, pointing up at the building, and somewhere in that crowd was my daughter, waiting for me to keep my promise. The boy in my arms had stopped coughing, his breathing shallow and rapid, and I knew we had minutes at most before the smoke overcame us both. I leaned out the shattered window, feeling the blast of fresh air like a benediction. Below, firefighters were moving with organized purpose, some directing a ladder truck into position, others clearing the area beneath our window. I waved frantically, trying to catch their attention, trying to signal that we needed help now, not in the careful minutes it would take to extend a ladder 3 stories up. One of the firefighters spotted me, his shout alerting the others, and suddenly all attention was focused on our precarious position. The apartment groaned around us, the sound of structural failure that no amount of optimism could ignore. I looked down at the boy in my arms, at his soot-stained face and the way his small chest struggled for each breath, and made my final split-second decision of the evening. I'd entered a burning building for a child I barely knew. I'd put my own daughter at risk, broken every safety protocol I'd ever learned, all because I couldn't walk away from someone who needed help. What was one more insane choice in a night that had already redefined the boundaries of my courage? The bedspread was thick, quilted, designed for a child's room with patterns of cartoon characters that seemed absurdly cheerful given our circumstances. I wrapped it more securely around the boy, creating as much padding as I could, then did something that would either save his life or haunt me forever. I held him out the window, showing him to the firefighters below, making sure they understood what I was about to do. Then, with a prayer to whatever gods protected desperate mothers and the children they tried to save, I let him drop. Time stretched in that moment, each second expanding into an eternity as I watched the small bundle fall. The firefighters below had spread a net, were positioning themselves to catch him, but 3 stories was a long way to fall, and physics cared nothing for good intentions. The boy hit the net with an impact that made my heart stop, bounced once, twice, and then was engulfed by firefighters whose swift movements suggested he'd survived the fall. I couldn't hear if he was crying or screaming or silent, couldn't tell if my desperate gamble had saved him or simply added to the tragedy unfolding in the Riverside apartment. Then the floor beneath me gave way, and I was falling too, plunging through fire and smoke and shattered dreams with nothing but hope and promises to break my fall. I woke to the smell of antiseptic and the steady beep of medical equipment that had become familiar during my mother's final months. The hospital. I was in a hospital, which meant I was alive, which meant I hadn't broken my promise to Maya after all. The thought cut through the fog of painkillers and shock, bringing with it a surge of panic that made every monitor attached to my body start screaming. Where was my daughter? Was she safe? Had Mrs. Rodriguez found her in the chaos? The questions tumbled over each other, building into a crescendo of maternal terror that had me trying to sit up despite the protests of muscles I didn't know I'd injured. A hand pressed gently against my shoulder, firm enough to keep me in place but careful not to cause pain. Easy now, you took quite a fall. The voice was male, deep, with an accent I couldn't quite place through the haze. Italian maybe, or something close to it. You need to stay still while the doctors make sure everything's working the way it should. But my daughter, I managed, my throat raw from smoke inhalation. Maya, she's 6, dark hair, she was wearing a purple jacket. I told her to find Simra's Rodriguez, but I need to know she's safe, I need to see her. The hand on my shoulder squeezed gently, a gesture of reassurance that carried surprising comfort from a stranger. She's fine. She's with your neighbor in the waiting room. They wouldn't let her back here until you woke up, but she's been asking about you every 5 minutes for the past 3 hours. The relief was so intense it brought tears to my eyes. mixing with the grit and smoke residue that still clung to my face. My vision was blurry, whether from tears or trauma I couldn't tell, but I blinked until the man beside my bed came into focus. He was the father from apartment 3B, though I'd never seen him like this. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a simple black sweater that showed off shoulders built for carrying weight most people couldn't imagine. His dark hair was disheveled in a way that suggested he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly, and his eyes, those dark eyes his son had inherited, were fixed on me with an intensity that made something in my chest flutter despite the circumstances. There was something dangerous about him, I realized, something that had nothing to do with the fire or the evening's chaos. This was a man accustomed to command, to getting what he wanted, to making grown men nervous with nothing more than a look. "Your son," I said, the memory of dropping him from that window making my stomach clench. "Is he okay? Did he survive the fall?" Something shifted in his expression. A crack in the controlled facade that revealed depths of emotion he usually kept carefully hidden. "He's alive because of you. Smoke inhalation, some minor burns on his hands, but the doctors say he'll make a full recovery. You saved his life, Miss Carter." "Sophia Carter," I corrected automatically, then wondered why it mattered what this stranger called me. And I just did what anyone would have done. The look he gave me suggested he knew exactly how rare what I'd done actually was. Most people wouldn't have gone back into a burning building for a neighbor's child. Most people would have chosen their own safety, their own daughter's security over a stranger's son. "You risked everything for my boy. That's not a debt I take lightly." There was something in the way he said debt that made it sound like more than gratitude, like some kind of binding contract I hadn't consciously agreed to. "I'm Matteo Castellano," he continued, "and my son's name is Luca. We've lived in your building for 6 months, and I've noticed you." The admission caught me off guard. I'd noticed him too, in the way single mothers notice attractive men while simultaneously reminding themselves they don't have time or energy for complications. But I'd never imagined he'd paid attention to me, a nursing assistant struggling to make ends meet, working double shifts to afford dance classes and decent school supplies. "What do you mean you've noticed me?" The question came out more defensive than I'd intended. Years of being overlooked, making it hard to believe someone like him would see someone like me. Matteo settled into the chair beside my bed with fluid grace, his presence somehow making the sterile hospital room feel smaller and more intimate. "I've watched you with your daughter, the way you talk to her like she's a person, not just a child, how you always make sure she goes through the door first, how you hold her hand in the parking lot even though she's probably old enough to walk on her own. I've seen you come home at midnight after working a double shift and still take time to read her a bedtime story through the wall." He paused, something vulnerable flickering across his features. "My son lost his mother 2 years ago. I've been trying to figure out how to be enough for him, how to be both parents. Watching you showed me it was possible." The grief in his voice resonated with something in my own experience. I'd been both parents to Maya since her father decided family life wasn't the adventure he'd signed up for, walking out when she was barely 2 years old. Some nights I felt like I was drowning in the responsibility, terrified I wasn't enough, that my daughter would grow up damaged by the absence of a father and the exhaustion of a mother working 3 jobs to keep them afloat. "You're doing better than you think," I said softly. "Your son talks about you to the other kids in the courtyard. He says you make the best pancakes and that you can fix anything." Matteo's smile was brief but genuine, transforming his face from dangerous to devastatingly handsome. "He says that, even after I burned them last Tuesday? Especially after you burned them. He told everyone his papa tried to make Mickey Mouse shapes, but they turned into monsters instead. Apparently that made breakfast an adventure." The laugh that escaped him was rusty, like something that didn't get used often enough. "That sounds like Luca. He has a gift for finding the positive in disasters. Must have gotten it from his mother." A nurse appeared then, checking my vitals with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times. "You're lucky," she said, noting something on her tablet. "It's like burns on your hands and forearms, smoke inhalation, a mild concussion, and some spectacular bruising, but nothing that won't heal. You fell through the floor of apartment 3B and landed on a collapsed section of ceiling that had created an air pocket in the apartment below. The firefighters said you shouldn't be alive, that falling through 2 floors should have killed you, or at least broken every bone in your body." I looked at my hands, seeing them properly for the first time. They were wrapped in white gauze that covered burns I'd gotten breaking the window and grabbing the hot doorknob. The pain was distant, held at bay by whatever medications they'd pumped into me, but I knew it would come later. Everything always came later. The bill for choices made in moments of crisis. "How long do I need to stay here?" The nurse consulted her tablet again. "Doctor wants to keep you overnight for observation, make sure the smoke inhalation hasn't caused any complications. If everything looks good tomorrow morning, you can go home." The word caught in my throat as reality came crashing back. I didn't have a home anymore. Apartment 2C had almost certainly been damaged by fire or water or both. Everything Maya and I owned, our clothes, her toys, the photo albums with pictures of my mother, my nursing textbooks, the emergency fund I'd been building in cash because I didn't trust banks after watching my mother's medical bills drain her accounts. All of it was probably gone, reduced to ash or ruined by the water the firefighters had used to contain the blaze. Matteo must have seen something change in my expression because his hand found mine, careful of the bandages. "Don't worry about your apartment, I've already made arrangements. You and Maya will stay in one of my properties until yours is repaired or you find something new. It's the least I can do after what you did for Luca. The offer was generous, maybe too generous. And every instinct I'd developed surviving as a single mother screamed warnings about accepting help that came with strings I couldn't see yet. I can't accept that, I said, even though I had no idea where else we would go. My savings account had maybe $800, not nearly enough for a security deposit and first month's rent in a city where affordable housing was increasingly a fantasy. I appreciate the offer, but I'll figure something out. Mateo's expression hardened slightly, the dangerous edge I'd noticed earlier becoming more pronounced. You saved my son's life. In my world, that creates obligations. You don't get to refuse help that I'm honor-bound to provide. Your world? What exactly do you do, Mr. Castellano? The silence that followed my question was heavy with implications I was only beginning to understand. When Mateo finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was choosing his words very carefully. I'm a businessman, Miss Carter. I manage various interests throughout the city, some more legitimate than others. What matters is that I have resources, and those resources are now at your disposal. Please don't insult us both by pretending you can handle this alone when you clearly can't. The bluntness should have offended me, but there was truth in his words that cut through pride and desperation alike. I couldn't handle this alone. I had no family left after my mother died, no close friends who could take in a woman and child indefinitely, no safety net beyond my own determination to keep moving forward no matter what obstacles appeared. Maya deserved better than a mother sleeping in her car while trying to figure out their next move. She deserved stability, safety, the kind of security I'd been working my entire adult life to provide. Fine, I said, the word tasting like defeat and surrender and maybe, just maybe, hope. But this is temporary, just until I can figure out something permanent, and I pay rent, whatever the market rate is for wherever you're putting us. I won't be a charity case. The smile Mateo gave me was sharp enough to cut. I wouldn't dare treat you like charity. You're far too dangerous for that. Dangerous? I'm a nursing assistant who just lost everything. How am I dangerous? He leaned forward, his dark eyes holding mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. You ran into a burning building without hesitation. You dropped a child from a third-story window and trusted strangers to catch him. You broke every safety rule that exists because saving a life mattered more than saving yourself. That kind of courage, that kind of selfless instinct is more dangerous than any weapon I've ever encountered. People like you change the world, Miss Carter. You've certainly changed mine. Before I could respond to that declaration, the door burst open and Maya ran in. Her purple jacket covered in soot and her face streaked with tears, followed by Mrs. Rodriguez apologizing profusely in rapid-fire Spanish. My daughter launched herself at me with the single-minded determination of someone who'd been holding back terror for hours, and I wrapped my bandaged arms around her as carefully as I could, breathing in the smell of smoke and strawberry shampoo and home. You came back, Maya sobbed against my shoulder. You promised and you came back. Always, baby, I whispered, holding her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had just tilted sideways. I'll always come back to you. Over her dark curls, I met Mateo's eyes and saw something in his expression that mirrored what I was feeling. We were parents who'd do anything to protect our children, who'd walk through fire or make deals with dangerous strangers or reshape our entire lives if that's what survival required. Whatever complications accepting his help might bring. Whatever strings attached to this arrangement I couldn't yet see, none of it mattered compared to keeping my daughter safe. Mateo stood, the movement drawing Maya's attention. She lifted her head from my shoulder, her tears stopping as she studied the man who'd been keeping vigil at my bedside. You're Luca's papa, she said with the straightforward honesty of children. Is he okay? Could my mama save him? He's alive because your mother's very brave, Mateo said gently, crouching down so he was at her level. Would you like to meet him? He's been asking about the girl with the purple jacket who told everyone her mama was a hero. Maya looked up at me for permission and I nodded despite the exhaustion pulling at every cell in my body. Mateo offered his hand and my daughter took it without hesitation, trusting this stranger because I'd shown him trust first. As they walked toward the door, Mateo looked back at me one more time. Rest, Miss Carter. Tomorrow we'll talk about the future. Tonight, just know that you're safe, your daughter's safe, and that debt I mentioned, I always pay what I owe. Then he was gone, taking my 6-year-old daughter to meet his 4-year-old son, leaving me alone in a hospital bed with burns on my hands and the terrifying certainty that my life would never be the same. I'd saved a child from a fire and somehow bound myself to a man whose world operated by rules I didn't understand. A businessman, he'd called himself, with interests both legitimate and otherwise. What had I gotten myself into? And why did part of me, the part that had spent 3 years feeling invisible and exhausted and alone, feel like maybe, just maybe, being seen by someone like Mateo Castellano might not be the worst thing that could happen? The morning brought clarity and pain in equal measure. The medications had worn off enough that I could feel every burn, every bruise, every muscle that had been pushed beyond its limits during those desperate minutes in the fire. But more than the physical pain, I felt the weight of decisions I'd made without fully understanding their consequences. consequences. A nurse helped me shower, careful of the bandages that covered my hands and forearms, and provided clothes that Mateo had apparently arranged to be delivered. Not the designer labels I'd glimpsed in his wardrobe during those months of casual observation, or quality basics that fit perfectly, too perfectly, which suggested he'd been more observant of me than I'd realized. Maya had spent the night with Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd volunteered to keep her until I was released. The arrangement had given me time to think, to process what acceptance of Mateo's offer really meant. I'd built my entire adult life on the principle of self-sufficiency, on never owing anyone anything because debt always came with strings that strangled you slowly. My ex-husband had taught me that lesson thoroughly. His financial support always tied to demands about how I should dress, who I should see, what dreams I was allowed to pursue. Freedom had come at the cost of security, and I'd chosen freedom without hesitation. Now I was choosing security, at least temporarily, and the irony wasn't lost on me. The doctor cleared me for discharge with a list of prescriptions I couldn't afford and instructions for wound care that would require supplies I no longer own. Everything will be taken care of, the nurse assured me when I asked about billing. Mr. Castellano has handled all the expenses. Of course he had. The debt was accumulating faster than I could calculate, building into something I couldn't hope to repay on a nursing assistant's salary. What did a life cost in Mateo Castellano's world? What interest rate applied to obligations created by burning buildings and desperate rescues? Mateo arrived to collect me personally, driving a black sedan that probably cost more than I'd make in 5 years. He moved around the car to open my door with old-world courtesy that felt deliberate, practiced, like everything about him was carefully calculated for maximum effect. Maya was in the back seat, freshly bathed and wearing new clothes that Mrs. Rodriguez must have purchased. My daughter launched into an enthusiastic description of her morning with Luca, how they'd played with his toy trucks and watched cartoons, and he'd shared his breakfast even though he didn't really like sharing. The drive through the city should have been familiar, but everything looked different through the lens of my new reality. We passed the Riverside apartments and I couldn't stop myself from staring at the damage. The third floor was a blackened skeleton, windows blown out, walls collapsed. The cheerful yellow paint I'd once thought made the building look welcoming now streaked with soot and ash. My home was gone, truly gone, and the finality of it hit me harder than I'd expected. Those weren't just possessions that had burned. They were pieces of the life I'd built, evidence that I'd survived and even occasionally thrived despite impossible odds. We're not stopping, I asked as Mateo drove past the building without slowing. There's nothing worth salvaging, he said quietly. The fire marshal won't clear the building for entry for at least another week, and even then, the structural damage to your floor makes it unlikely you'll be able to recover anything meaningful. I've already contacted your landlord about terminating your lease without penalty. The efficiency of it should have been comforting, but instead, it made me feel like control was slipping through my bandaged fingers. He was making decisions about my life, practical decisions that needed making, but without consulting me first. Where are we going? Mateo glanced at me, something unreadable flickering across his features. Somewhere safe, somewhere you and Maya can have stability while you figure out your next move. And before you argue about accepting charity, remember that this isn't optional. You saved Luca's life, and in my world, that creates obligations that transcend your discomfort with accepting help. There was steel beneath the gentle word, a reminder that for all his courtesy and careful concern, Mateo Castellano was accustomed to having his decisions followed without question. The somewhere safe turned out to be a townhouse in a neighborhood I'd never been able to afford even in my fantasy. Tree-lined streets where luxury cars sat in driveways like casual afterthoughts, children playing in yards protected by rot-torn fences that were decorative rather than defensive, the kind of place where people didn't work 3 jobs just to make rent, where retirement accounts and college funds were assumptions rather than impossible dreams. Mateo pulled into the driveway of a cream-colored townhouse with black shutters and a small garden that suggested someone cared enough to maintain it. This is yours for as long as you need it, he said, cutting the engine. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, fully furnished. The lease is paid through the end of the year with an option to renew if necessary. Grocery delivery is scheduled for this afternoon with basics to get you started. I've taken the liberty of enrolling Maya in the elementary school 3 blocks away, same grade she was in before, and her dance studio has been notified of the address. He paused, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. There's $5,000 cash to cover immediate expenses, clothing, medical supplies, whatever you need. Consider it an advance against the job I'm offering you. The word job cut through my mounting panic about accepting so much. What job? I'm a nursing assistant. What could you possibly need me for? Mateo's smile was sharp. Luca needs someone who understands children, someone who can provide the kind of care and attention I can't give him while managing my business interests. You need income and stability. This arrangement benefits us both. His nanny quit 2 weeks ago, and I've been struggling to find someone I trust with my son's safety. You've already proven you'll protect him with your life. That's not something I can find through an employment agency. The logic was sound, almost too sound, and I found myself searching for the trap hidden in generosity that seemed too perfect. What are the hours? What exactly would you expect from me? Standard childcare, Mateo said. School drop-off and pick-up, afternoon activities, dinner preparation, bedtime routine. I'm usually home by 7. earlier when possible. Weekends are yours unless I have unexpected business that requires my attention. The salary is $5,000 a month plus room and board. He gestured toward the townhouse. You and Maya live here. Luca stays with me during the week and visits on weekends when you're working. It keeps the arrangement professional while ensuring both our children have stability. $5,000 a month was more than I currently made working 60-hour weeks at the nursing home. Add in free housing and the calculation became impossible to refuse, regardless of whatever complications lurked beneath the surface. What about benefits? I heard myself asking, already knowing I was going to accept. Health insurance? Because Maya needs regular checkups and I'm going to need follow-up care for these burns. Full benefits, Mateo confirmed. Medical, dental, vision, retirement account if you stay longer than 6 months. This is a legitimate employment arrangement, Sophia. I pay my taxes and follow labor laws, at least in this particular business venture. The emphasis on this particular venture reminded me that Mateo had described himself as having interests both legitimate and otherwise. What exactly do you do? I asked, not for the first time. Because if I'm going to be taking care of your son, I need to know what kind of world I'm entering. What risks might follow him home from whatever business you conduct. Mateo's expression hardened, the dangerous edge I'd glimpsed before becoming more pronounced. I own restaurants, import-export businesses, a few entertainment venues. Most of what I do is perfectly legal. Some of it operates in areas where legality is more subjective, but my son is kept separate from all of it. No business is conducted at my home. No associates visit when Luca is present. He attends private school with children whose parents know nothing about my other interests. The careful compartmentalization spoke volumes about the kind of life Mateo led, one where separation between legitimate and illegitimate enterprises required constant vigilance. Are you connected? I asked, using the euphemism everyone understood but rarely spoke aloud. Are you part of organized crime? The bluntness of the question seemed to surprise him. Most people dance around that subject, afraid of the answer. You just asked directly. I spent the last 3 years watching my mother die slowly while insurance companies found creative ways to deny coverage, I said. I learned that euphemisms and polite fiction don't change reality. They just make it easier to pretend we're not seeing what's right in front of us. So yes, I'm asking directly. Are you Mafia? Mateo studied me for a long moment and I had the sense he was recalibrating something, adjusting his assessment based on information I'd just provided. My family has been part of certain organizations for 3 generations, he said finally. We have rules, structure, codes of conduct that govern behavior. We take care of our own and we handle our problems internally. What we don't do is involve civilians, especially children. Luca knows I own restaurants. He knows I work hard and travel sometime. He doesn't know anything else, and I intend to keep it that way for as long as possible. The honesty was more than I'd expected, and it forced me to make a choice. I could walk away, refuse this offer, and try to rebuild our lives from nothing with no safety net and no prospects. Or I could accept that my moment of courage in a burning building had connected me to a world I'd only encountered through news reports and crime documentaries. A world where men like Mateo Castellano wielded power that operated outside conventional structures. Where violence was a tool rather than a last resort. Where loyalty meant everything and betrayal meant death. It should have terrified me. Maybe it did. But Maya deserved better than watching her mother work herself to exhaustion for wages that barely covered rent. And some part of me, a part I wasn't entirely comfortable acknowledging, was curious about this man who'd watched me through walls and noticed the small ways I tried to be enough for my daughter. I'll take the job, I said before I could talk myself out of it, but I have conditions. Mateo's eyebrow rose slightly, amusement flickering across his features. You're in no position to negotiate. I just did, I countered. First, Maya's safety is non-negotiable. If anything connected to your business ever threatens her, the arrangement ends immediately. Second, I want everything in writing. Employment contract, housing agreement, all of it documented so we both know exactly what we've agreed to. Third, you tell me the truth when I ask direct questions. I won't work for someone who lies to me, regardless of how well they pay. For a moment I thought he might refuse, might tell me to take the generous offer as presented or walk away empty-handed. Instead, that sharp smile returned, transforming his face into something that was both dangerous and devastatingly attractive. You drive a hard bargain for someone who lost everything yesterday. I like that survival instinct beyond just physical courage. He extended his hand, careful of my bandages. Deal, but I have a condition too. What's that? You trust me to keep my son safe and you don't judge the choices I make in my other business. You don't have to approve, but you don't interfere. Can you accept that? The question hung in the air between us, weighted with implications I was only beginning to understand. By accepting his offer, I was agreeing to look the other way, to knowingly benefit from activities I might find morally questionable while maintaining plausible deniability about the details. It was a compromise with principles I'd once thought were absolute, a recognition that survival sometimes required flexibility in areas where I'd always demanded rigidity. I thought about Maya, about the opportunities this arrangement would provide her, about the stability she deserved after years of watching me struggle. I thought about my mother, who'd worked 3 jobs until cancer took that option away, who died knowing her medical bills would haunt me for years. I thought about all the times I'd been desperate enough to consider worse compromises than this. "Deal," I said, taking his hand. Mateo's grip was firm, warm, despite the cool morning air, and when he smiled this time, it reached his eyes. "Welcome to the family, Sophia Carter. Something tells me our lives just got a lot more interesting." The townhouse was everything Mateo had promised and more than I'd ever allowed myself to imagine. Hardwood floors gleamed in the afternoon sunlight that poured through windows dressed in curtains that probably cost more than my old monthly rent. The furniture was tasteful without being ostentatious, chosen by someone who understood the difference between wealth and style. Maya ran from room to room with the unbridled enthusiasm of a child discovering a palace, her voice echoing through spaces that felt impossibly large after years in our cramped apartment. The master bedroom had an ensuite bathroom with a soaking tub I could already imagine sinking into after long days. The second bedroom was clearly meant for Maya, decorated in soft purples and creams with a bed that looked like something from a fairy tale. The third bedroom remained neutral, set up as a guest room or office, waiting for whatever purpose we might need. Mateo had stayed only long enough to show us through the house, pointing out where he'd stocked basic necessities and leaving the envelope of cash on the kitchen counter with a reminder that I should call if we needed anything else. Then he was gone, and for the first time since the fire, I was alone with my daughter in a space that was supposedly ours. The silence felt strange after the constant noise of apartment living. No footsteps from units above or arguments bleeding through thin walls. Just quiet, broken only by Maya's delighted discoveries and the soft hum of central heating that actually worked. I spent the afternoon making lists, cataloging everything we'd lost and everything we'd need to replace. Clothes were the priority. Maya had outgrown most of what she owned anyway, and my work uniforms were gone along with the few nice outfits I'd kept for interviews or the occasional attempt at a social life that never materialized. Toiletries, school supplies, the mundane details of existence that you took for granted until a fire reduced your life to what you'd been carrying when the alarm went off. The $5,000 Mateo had given me felt like a fortune and a responsibility in equal measure. Every dollar I spent was another increment on the debt I owed him, another string tying me to a man whose world operated by rules I didn't understand. Maya adapted to the change with the resilience of children who'd already learned that stability was temporary. She claimed her new bedroom with the same matter-of-fact acceptance she'd shown when we'd moved from a two-bedroom to a one-bedroom to save money. When I tucked her in that first night in a bed that was entirely hers with blankets that smelled fresh and new, she looked up at me with those enormous brown eyes and asked the question I'd been dreading. "Are we going to stay here forever?" I stroked her hair, buying time to figure out how to explain temporary safety to a 6-year-old who deserved permanence. "For a while, baby, until Mama can find us our own place again." She considered this with the seriousness she applied to all important matters. "I like it here. It's quiet. And Luca is nice. Said we could be best friends if I want." "That would be nice," I agreed, even as part of me worried about the complications of our children forming attachments when everything about this arrangement felt precarious. The next morning brought Luca and the reality of my new employment. Mateo arrived at 7 sharp, his son trailing behind him with a backpack almost as big as he was and the sleepy expression of a 4-year-old who'd been woken earlier than he preferred. The boy's face lit up when he saw me, recognition and something like relief transforming his features. "You're the fire lady," he announced, then threw his arms around my legs with the unconscious affection of young children. "You saved me from the smoke monster." "The fire, yes," I said gently, kneeling so I was at his level despite the protest from muscles still recovering. "How are you feeling? Are your hands okay?" He held up small palms that showed minor burns, already healing with the speed of youth. "They hurt sometimes, but Papa says I was very brave." "You were incredibly brave," I confirmed, meeting Mateo's eyes over his son's dark head. The look that passed between us carried weight I couldn't yet interpret. Acknowledgement of shared trauma and something else I wasn't ready to name. Mateo ran through Luca's routine with the efficiency of someone accustomed to briefing. Breakfast preferences, school schedule, afternoon activities, the careful structure that helped his son navigate a world that had taken his mother too early. Piano lessons on Tuesdays, soccer practice on Thursdays. Bedtime at 8 with 2 stories and a nightlight that projected stars on the ceiling. The details painted a picture of a father trying desperately to be enough, to provide normalcy while managing whatever dangerous interests demanded his attention during business hours. "I've arranged for a car service to handle school transport," Mateo said, handing me a business card. "They're discreet and thoroughly vetted. No one will ask questions about why my son is being picked up by his new nanny." The emphasis on discreet reminded me that Mateo's life required layers of security I'd never considered necessary. The days fell into rhythm faster than I'd expected. Morning routines with both children, getting them fed and ready for their respective schools. Maya was thriving at her new elementary school, making friends with the ease of someone who'd learned to adapt quickly. Afternoons were for Luca, structured activities that kept him engaged and exhausted enough for early bedtimes. Piano lessons revealed a natural aptitude that made his teacher enthuse about his potential. Soccer practice showed less natural talent but enthusiasm that made up for technical skill. He was a sweet child, affectionate and thoughtful in ways that made my heart ache for what he'd lost when his mother died. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me with an expression that suggested he was cataloging my differences from the woman he barely remembered. comparing the way I cut his sandwiches or tied his shoes to some fading memory he was desperate not to lose. Mateo was true to his word about being home by 7 most evenings. He'd arrive still wearing the expensive suits that marked him as someone important, but the first thing he'd do was loosen his tie and scoop Luca into his arms. The transformation was remarkable, the dangerous businessman becoming just a father grateful for time with his son. He'd ask about Luca's day with genuine interest, listening to 4-year-old rambling about playground politics and the injustice of nap time with the same attention he probably gave to business negotiations worth millions. Sometimes he'd stay for dinner, casual meals that felt dangerously domestic, the 4 of us sitting around a table like we were actually a family instead of an employer and employee sharing space. The attraction I'd felt in the hospital grew stronger with proximity. I tried to ignore it to maintain professional distance, but Mateo made that impossible in ways that seemed effortless. The way he'd touch my shoulder when thanking me for taking care of Luca, how his eyes would track me moving through the kitchen, appreciation in his gaze that had nothing to do with childcare skills, the careful courtesy that somehow felt more intimate than casual contact, like he was constantly aware of the space between us and choosing deliberately not to close it, yet the unspoken, yet hung in the air between us, building tension that made ordinary interactions feel charged with possibility. 3 weeks into the arrangement, everything changed. I was cleaning up after dinner when Mateo's phone rang, the particular tone that made his expression shudder into something cold and focused. He took the call in the study he'd established in the townhouse, a room I'd been careful not to enter without invitation, but even through the closed door, I could hear the shift in his voice, the edge that transformed him from devoted father to something far more dangerous. When he emerged 20 minutes later, his eyes were hard and he had to leave town for a few days. Business that can't be delayed. You'll stay here with Luca until I return. The statement was presented as fact rather than request. Assumption of my compliance that should have irritated me but somehow didn't. Is this the kind of business where I should worry? I asked, keeping my voice low so the children wouldn't hear. Maya and Luca were playing in the living room, building elaborate structures from blocks that seemed designed for maximum collapse drama. Mateo's smile was sharp. You should always worry when I leave on business, but I'm very good at coming back. He moved closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive that probably had a name I wouldn't recognize. While I'm gone, Vincent will check in daily. He's my head of security, completely trustworthy. If anything seems off, anything that makes you uncomfortable, you call him. The number is programmed into your phone. This is important, Sophia, do you understand? The seriousness in his tone sent ice through my vein. What kind of danger are we talking about? Probably none, he said, though the qualifier worried me. But I have enemies who might see my absence as an opportunity. They wouldn't dare move against me directly, but collateral damage is always a risk in my line of work. Vincent will keep you safe, and if anything happens to me, there's an envelope in the study desk with instructions and enough money to get you and Maya anywhere you want to go. The casual mention of his potential death should have terrified me more than it did. Instead, I found myself reaching out, my bandaged hand touching his arm with surprising boldness. Don't let anything happen to you. Luca needs his father. He needs you. Mateo's hand covered mine, his touch gentle despite the danger coiling beneath his surface. Calm. Is that the only reason you want me to be careful? The question hung between us, heavy with implications neither of us was quite ready to address directly. I could have deflected, maintained the professional distance that was supposed to govern our relationship. Instead, I found myself being honest in a way that felt reckless. No, I said quietly. It's not the only reason. Something flared in his dark eyes. Recognition and satisfaction and heat that made my breath catch. When I get back, we're going to talk about that, about what you mean to me beyond just being Luca's nanny. Can you wait for me to come back so we can have that conversation properly? I nodded, not trusting my voice, and Mateo squeezed my hand gently before pulling away. He spent an hour with Luca, reading extra stories and promising to bring back something special from his trip. Then he was gone, and I was left in a townhouse that suddenly felt too large and too quiet, watching through the window as his black sedan disappeared into the night. Vincent arrived the next morning, a mountain of a man with silver-threaded hair and eyes that missed nothing. He introduced himself with professional courtesy, then positioned himself in a way that gave him sight lines to both entrances while remaining unobtrusive. The children accepted his presence with the adaptability they'd shown for everything else, though Maya whispered to me later that Miss Vince looked like he could fight bears. 3 days passed with agonizing slowness. Mateo called twice, brief conversations that revealed nothing about where he was or what he was doing, just checking that Luca was okay and that Vincent hadn't reported any concerns. His voice sounded strained, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion, and I found myself worrying in ways that had nothing to do with my job security. On the 4th morning, Vincent's phone rang while we were having breakfast. I watched his expression change, saw something that might have been relief flicker across his features before the professional mask returned. He's coming home, Vincent said after ending the call. He'll be here within the hour. When Mateo finally walked through the door, Luca launched himself at his father with the force of a child who'd been holding fear at bay through sheer force of will. Mateo caught him easily, holding his son like he was the most precious thing in the world, and over Luca's dark head, his eyes found mine. There was a story written in the shadows beneath those eyes and the careful way he moved that suggested pain he was trying to hide. In the barely visible bruise along his jaw that makeup hadn't quite concealed. Whatever business had called him away had been violent, dangerous, maybe nearly fatal, but he was home, and the relief I felt was entirely inappropriate for an employee watching her employer return from a business trip. That evening, after Luca was asleep and Maya was reading in her room, Matteo found me in the kitchen. "We need to talk," he said, and the conversation we'd been avoiding for 3 weeks finally began. Matteo moved slowly, each step measured in a way that suggested he was fighting pain with every breath. The bruise on his jaw was just the visible evidence of whatever violence he'd encountered during those 4 days away. I'd learned enough about reading bodies during my nursing training to recognize the signs of broken ribs in the way he held himself, the shallow breathing that minimized movement, the careful positioning that protected his left side. Without asking permission, I moved toward him, my professional instincts overriding the awkwardness of the personal conversation we were supposed to be having. "You're hurt. Let me see." His hand caught mine gently, stopping my examination before it could begin. "It's nothing I haven't survived before." "That's not the reassurance you think it is," I said, pulling my hand free and gesturing toward the kitchen table. "Sit down before you fall down and let me at least assess the damage." For a moment I thought he might refuse, might retreat behind the walls of masculine pride that made men ignore injuries until they became life-threatening complications. Instead, he lowered himself into a chair with controlled grace that couldn't quite hide his wince. The expensive suit jacket came off to reveal a dress shirt that had been white that morning but now showed signs of hastily cleaned bloodstain. "My blood or someone else's?" I asked, helping him ease the shirt over his shoulders. The question should have horrified me, but 3 weeks of living on the edges of Matteo's world had already begun reshaping my understanding of violence. "Mostly someone else's," he said, a dark satisfaction in his voice that probably should have frightened me more than it did. "The business that called me away required permanent resolution. The people who thought my absence created an opportunity won't be making that mistake again." The bruising across his ribs was spectacular. Deep purple and black that spoke of significant impact, possibly multiple impacts delivered with precision meant to cause maximum pain without quite breaking bones. Though given the way he was breathing, I suspected at least one rib might be cracked despite the careful calibration of violence. "You need a doctor." Matteo's hand found my wrist, his grip firm despite his injuries. "No doctors. They ask questions I can't answer and they're required to report certain types of injuries to authorities I prefer to avoid. You'll have to do. I'm a nursing assistant, not a doctor. I can clean wounds and change bandages, but if you have internal bleeding or a punctured lung, I'm not equipped to handle that." His smile was sharp despite the pain it must have cost him. "I've survived worse with less skilled care. You'll be fine." The trust implicit in that statement settled over me with unexpected weight. Matteo Castellano, a man who trusted no one completely according to his own admission, was putting his life in my inexperienced hands because the alternative involved risks he wasn't willing to take. I moved through assessment with the methodical efficiency my training had instilled, checking for signs of serious internal damage while trying to ignore the intimacy of touching his bare skin, of feeling muscle and heat beneath my exploring fingers. Everything hurt. I could see it in the tension of his jaw and the careful stillness he maintained, but nothing suggested immediately life-threatening complication. The worst damage was a deep laceration along his left shoulder blade, poorly stitched by someone with more urgency than skill. "This needs to be cleaned and restitched properly," I said, examining the angry red edges that suggested infection was already taking hold. "When did this happen?" 2 days ago, Matteo admitted. "We didn't have time for proper medical attention, and the man who stitched it was better with explosives than sutures. I have supplies in my bathroom." Sophia had stocked the townhouse with more than basic first aid I'd discovered. The cabinet in my bathroom held everything from butterfly bandages to prescription-strength antibiotics, a collection that spoke to frequent need for discreet medical care. I gathered what I'd need and returned to find Matteo exactly as I'd left him, still as a statue except for the shallow rise and fall of his breathing. "This is going to hurt," I warned as I began removing the crude stitches. He made no sound as I worked, no indication of the pain I knew I was causing, though his knuckles went white where they gripped the table edge. The wound was worse once I'd cleaned away the dried blood and inflamed tissue, deeper than I'd initially assessed, requiring more stitches than I'd done in years of clinical practice. My hands trembled slightly as I threaded the suture needle, aware that this was so far beyond my scope of practice that I could lose my license if anyone found out. But Matteo's life might depend on my steady hands and rudimentary skills, so I forced the trembling to stop and focused on creating small, even stitches that would hold tissue together while minimizing scarring. "You're good at this," Matteo said quietly as I worked. The observation carried surprise, as if he'd expected competence, but not the careful precision I was applying to his injury. "I had good teachers," I replied, concentrating on the angle of my needle, "and I've always been good with my hands. Good at seeing how things should fit together and making them work. My mother used to say I should have been a surgeon instead of a nursing assistant, but medical school wasn't exactly in the budget for a single mother with a GED. The admission slipped out before I could stop it. A piece of personal history I rarely shared because it felt too much like making excuses for choices I'd made and roads I hadn't taken. "You could go back to school now," Matteo said. "The salary I'm paying you is more than enough to cover tuition at any program in the city. With your intelligence and dedication, you'd be an excellent physician." The casual certainty in his voice, The assumption that I could simply restart a dream I'd abandoned years ago made something twist in my chest. It's not that simple. I have Maya to think about, responsibilities that don't pause for personal ambitions. Besides, I'm 28. By the time I finished medical school and residency, I'd be nearly 40. That's not too old to become the person you're meant to be, Mateo countered. And Maya would be proud to have a mother who pursued her dreams instead of letting circumstance dictate her limits. I finished the final stitch and tied it off with more force than necessary, bothered by how easily he saw through defenses I'd spent years constructing. You don't know anything about my circumstances or my limits. You've known me for 3 weeks, and suddenly you're an expert on what I should do with my life. The anger felt good, cleaner than the complicated emotions Mateo inspired in me, easier than acknowledging he might be right about possibilities I'd convinced myself were impossible. I know that you ran into a burning building to save a stranger's child, he said quietly. I know that you negotiate for your daughter's safety while accepting help you desperately need. I know that you care for my son with the same devotion you show Maya, that you ask direct questions when everyone else dances around uncomfortable truths, and that you haven't run screaming from my world despite having every reason to do exactly that. Those things tell me more about your character than years of casual acquaintance ever could. The observation was too close to vulnerability, too honest for the professional distance I'd been trying to maintain. I busied myself bandaging his shoulder, applying antibiotic ointment with careful attention to avoid meeting his eyes. He said we needed to talk about us, about what this is becoming, so let's talk instead of analyzing my abandoned dreams. Mateo's hand caught mine again, his touch gentler this time, thumb tracing patterns across my knuckles in a way that made my breath catch. What this is becoming terrifies me, he admitted. I built my life on careful control, on never letting anyone close enough to be used against me. My enemies would exploit any weakness, and caring about you, about Maya, that's a weakness I can't afford, but I find myself caring anyway. The confession hung in the air between us, weighted with all the reasons this was a terrible idea, and all the ways it felt inevitable despite the obstacles. I should say something I knew should either shut this down or acknowledge my own feel, but words felt inadequate for the tangle of fear and desire and desperate hope that had been building since that first night in the hospital. Instead, I found myself moving closer, my free hand reaching up to trace the bruise along his jaw with feather-light touches that made him close his eyes. You're not the only one who's terrified, I whispered. I've spent 3 years building walls around my heart because letting anyone in meant risking the kind of pain I barely survived the first time. But you make me want to tear down those walls, and that's more dangerous than anything your enemies could do. Mateo's hand slid into my hair, gentle, despite the strength I could feel coiled beneath his injuries. I would never hurt you the way he did. I would never abandon you or Maya, never make you feel like you weren't enough. I swear that on my son's life, on everything I value in this world. The intensity of his vow should have been excessive, dramatic in the way movie declarations always felt overblown. Instead, it felt like exactly what I needed to hear. A promise backed by the same absolute commitment he showed in every other aspect of his life. I believe you, I said, and realized I meant it completely. Whatever else Mateo Castellano might be, whatever violence his business required or moral compromises his world demanded, he was a man who kept his promises. The kiss happened gradually. A slow inevitability that gave both of us time to reconsider, to pull back, to choose safety over risk. Neither of us pulled back. When his lips finally met mine, it was with a gentleness that belied the violence written across his body, a carefulness that recognized I was something precious that shouldn't be rushed or handled roughly. The kiss deepened slowly, his tongue tracing the seam of my lips until I opened for him, and then the gentleness gave way to hunger that had been building for weeks. My hands found his face, careful of his bruises, and his arm wrapped around my waist, pulling me closer despite what it must have cost his injured ribs. We broke apart finally, both breathing hard, and I rested my forehead against his. This complicates everything. Everything was already complicated, Mateo countered, his smile sharp and satisfied. Now it's just honestly complicated instead of pretending we're just employer and employee. I laughed despite the situation, despite the danger and uncertainty and all the very reasonable objections my rational mind was trying to raise. What happens now? Now, he said, we figure this out together. You keep taking care of Luca, keep being amazing with Maya, and I keep paying you entirely too much money while trying to keep you safe from the consequences of my lifestyle. And when I'm not being a crime boss or you're not being a caregiver, we explore this thing between us and see where the plan was insane, completely against every principle of self-preservation I developed over years of protecting myself and Maya. But standing in that kitchen with Mateo's arm around me and the taste of him still on my lips, insanity felt like the only rational choice. Okay, I agreed. We'll figure it out together. The future was uncertain, probably dangerous, definitely complicated. But for the first time since the fire had consumed my old life, I felt like maybe the uncertainty wasn't something to fear. Maybe it was an opportunity to become someone I'd never allowed myself to imagine, to build something that wasn't just about survival, but about actually living. The next 2 months transformed the townhouse from temporary refuge into something that felt dangerously like home. Mateo's injuries healed slowly, each day revealing more of the man beneath the crime boss persona. He started staying for dinner most nights, claiming it was more efficient than cooking for himself, but I caught him watching our little makeshift family with an expression that suggested efficiency had nothing to do with his motivation. Maya and Luca had bonded with the intensity only children could achieve, becoming inseparable during the weekends when both lived under the same roof. They created elaborate games that involved complex rules I couldn't follow, built blanket forts that took over entire rooms, and developed the kind of sibling dynamic that made me ache for. The family structure I'd once thought Maya would never experience. The relationship between Matteo and me evolved in stolen moments between childcare responsibilities and his business demands. Late-night conversations after the children were asleep, where he'd tell me carefully edited stories about his day and I'd share frustrations about medical procedures I wished I could perform with proper training. Casual touches that lingered longer than necessary when passing in hallways. The way his eyes would track me moving through rooms, heat in his gaze that made my skin flush with awareness. We were careful never to display affection in front of the children, maintaining the fiction that our relationship was purely professional, but the fiction was wearing thin around the edges. Vincent had become a regular presence, arriving most mornings to brief Matteo on overnight developments in what he called the family business, with the same tone others might use for quarterly earnings reports. I learned to read the subtle signals that indicated the severity of situations. The way Vincent's jaw would tighten when delivering particularly bad news. How Matteo's eyes would go cold and focused when violence was required. They conducted these conversations in Italian when they didn't want me understanding details, but my maternal instincts were fluent in danger regardless of language barriers. I could tell when something big was developing, when the careful structure of Matteo's world was being threatened by forces I couldn't see but could sense in the tension that settled over the household. It was a Tuesday morning, perfectly ordinary in every way that mattered, when everything shifted. I was packing Luca's lunch, adding the extra cookies he loved, but Matteo pretended not to notice, when Vincent arrived earlier than usual. His expression carried urgency that made my stomach clench with instinctive fear. "We have a problem," he said without preamble, his eyes finding Matteo with the kind of look that transcended words. "The Calabrese family is making moves. They've approached 3 of our restaurant managers with offers to switch allegiance. Worse, they're asking questions about your son's new caregiver, specifically about the fire and the woman who saved him." The air in the kitchen turned cold despite the morning sunlight streaming through windows. Matteo's entire demeanor shifted, the loving father disappearing behind the dangerous man whose reputation preceded him through Chicago's underworld. "What kind of questions?" "Details about her background, her daughter, where they're living now." One of the managers mentioned that Sophia Carter seems to have landed well after losing everything, implied there might be more to the arrangement than just employer and employee. Vincent's eyes flicked to me briefly, apology in his expression. "They're building a narrative, boss, testing to see if there's leverage to be gained by threatening civilians you care about." I should have been terrified. Everything about this conversation confirmed my worst fears about the dangers inherent in Matteo's world. But standing in that kitchen with both men watching me carefully, waiting to see if I'd panic or demand to leave, I felt something else entirely. Anger, hot and bright, at people who would target children and vulnerable women as strategic moves in whatever game they were playing. "You're not sending us away," I said, the words coming out with more force than I'd intended. "That's what they want, isn't it? To make you choose between protecting your son and maintaining your position. To create the appearance of weakness by forcing you to hide the people you care about." Matteo studied me with an intensity that felt like physical touch. "You understand what staying means? That you and Maya become part of this, become targets that my enemies will use to hurt me? I've been part of this since the moment I ran into that burning building," I countered. "You can send us away, set us up somewhere safe and distant, but that doesn't change the fact that they already know we exist. It just makes us easier targets without your protection." The logic was sound even as the implications terrified me. Running wouldn't save us. It would just isolate us from the one person with resources and motivation to keep us alive. Vincent cleared his throat, the sound carrying approval he'd never voiced directly. "She's right, boss. Sending them away creates vulnerability without eliminating the threat. Better to keep them close where we can control the variables. Plus, it sends a message that you're not afraid of the Calabrese family's implied threats, that you're confident enough in your position to live openly with the woman and children under your protection." Matteo's hand found my shoulder, the touch carrying reassurance and possession in equal measure. "Then we adapt. Increase security around the townhouse, background checks on everyone who comes within 50 feet of Sophia or the children. I want armed surveillance 24 hours. Rotation every 6 hours to prevent complacency. And Vincent, make it clear through appropriate channels that anyone who touches my family answers to me personally." The casual use of the word family sent warmth through me, despite the danger we were discussing. In Matteo's world, family meant something absolute, a designation that came with protections and obligations that transcended legal definition. By claiming Maya and me as his family, he was drawing a line that even his enemies would think twice about crossing. The question was whether thinking twice would be enough to keep us safe, or if we'd just become pawns in a war one barely understood. The rest of that day passed in orchestrated chaos. Vincent brought in additional security personnel, men and women who blended into the neighborhood with practiced ease while maintaining constant vigilance. New locks appeared on doors and windows, the kind that required key codes and biometric scanning. Cameras were installed with sightlines covering every approach to the townhouse. By evening, our home had transformed into a fortress disguised as suburban normalcy. Maya noticed the changes with the perceptiveness children develop when their lives have been unstable. "Why are there so many new people around?" she asked as I tucked her into bed. Her voice carried concern she was trying to hide. "Bravery learned from watching me pretend strength during the years we'd struggled alone. Mr. Castellano wants to make sure we're extra safe," I explained, smoothing her hair back from her face. "Remember how I told you he runs businesses where sometimes people disagree with his decisions? Well, some of those people might try to cause problems, so he's making sure nothing bad happens to us, like the fire." Maya's question hit harder than she could know. "Exactly like the fire. But this time we're prepared. Nothing's going to happen to you, baby. I promise." The promise felt heavier this time, weighted with knowledge of threats I couldn't fully articulate to my 6-year-old daughter. After Maya fell asleep, I found Matteo in the study he'd claimed, surrounded by documents and speaking in rapid Italian to someone on the phone. He ended the call when he saw me, his expression softening in ways reserved for private moments. "She's scared," I said without preamble. "Maya, she's trying to be brave because that's what she thinks I need. But she's terrified that everything we've built here is about to disappear again. I can't keep doing this to her, Matteo. I can't keep promising safety and then having violence follow us everywhere we go." Matteo stood and moved around the desk, his hands framing my face with exquisite gentleness. "This isn't your fault. None of this is because of choices you made. You saved my son's life, and the consequences of that heroism are mine to handle. But I need you to trust me, to believe that I have the resources and determination to keep you and Maya safe. Can you do that?" The vulnerability in his question surprised me. This powerful man who commanded respect through fear and loyalty in equal measures, asking for my trust like it was something precious he couldn't demand. "I trust you," I said, meaning it despite the fear clawing at my chest. "But I'm terrified of what trusting you might cost." "Then be terrified with me," he whispered, pulling me close until I could feel his heartbeat against my cheek. "Because I'm terrified too. Terrified of failing you the way I failed Luca's mother, of being too late or too slow or too arrogant to see the threat until it's already destroyed everything that matters." He paused, his lips finding my forehead in a kiss that felt like benediction and apology. "But I'd rather be terrified together than safe and alone." We stood like that for a long time, finding comfort in proximity, while the security team Vincent had assembled patrolled the perimeter of our fortress home. Outside those walls, enemies were planning strategies that would test Matteo's power and my resolve, but inside we held each other and pretended that love might be enough to survive the storms gathering on the horizon. The next morning brought a delivery that changed everything. A package addressed to me, delivered through normal postal channels that should never have found me at an address only Matteo's inner circle knew. Inside was a single photograph taken from outside the townhouse showing Maya and Luca playing in the front yard 2 days earlier. No message, no demands, just the image and the implication it carried. They could reach us anytime they wanted. They knew where we lived, what our children looked like, how vulnerable we were despite all the security measures Vincent had implemented. I stared at that photograph with hands that trembled, seeing my daughter's smile and Luca's laughter captured by someone who viewed them as leverage rather than children. This was the reality of Matteo's world, the cost of caring about someone whose enemies measured weakness in the people he loved. When Matteo saw the photograph, something fundamental shifted in his expression. The careful control he usually maintained cracked, revealing rage so absolute it transformed him into someone I'd barely recognized. Vincent was summoned with a single phone call, other men whose names I didn't know arriving within hours. They gathered in the study while I kept the children occupied, their voices carrying through walls that suddenly felt too thin to contain the violence being planned. I couldn't hear specific words, but I didn't need to. The tone said everything about what would happen to whoever had taken that photograph, to the organization that thought threatening children was acceptable strategy. That evening, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into uneasy quiet, Matteo found me sitting in the dark living room. "I need to tell you something," he said, settling beside me with careful distance that felt like its own form of protection. "About Luca's mother. About how she died. It wasn't an accident or illness like I've let people believe. She was murdered. Targeted by enemies who thought killing her would weaken my position. They were right. Losing her nearly destroyed me, made me question everything about the life I'd built and the choices that put her in danger." The admission hung heavy between us. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you need to understand what staying with me really means. It means becoming a target for people who measure power in blood and tears. It means raising our children in a world where security teams are necessary and ordinary moments like playing in the yard require armed surveillance. It means trusting that I'll be strong enough, fast enough, ruthless enough to keep you safe when my enemies try to hurt me through." His hand found mine in the darkness. "I can't promise you a normal life, Sophia, but I can promise that anyone who threatens you or Maya or Luca will learn exactly why people fear my family." The photograph became a turning point in ways I hadn't anticipated. Instead of cowering behind increased security, I found myself studying Matteo's world with analytical precision, learning the names and faces of allies and enemies alike, understanding the complex web of relationships that govern Chicago's underworld. Vincent became an unlikely early teacher, recognizing something in me that most people missed. The same instincts that made me a good caregiver also made me perceptive about human behavior, capable of reading subtle signals that others overlook. He started including me in security briefings, at first just to keep me informed, but gradually realizing that my observations added value to their tactical planning. Mateo was initially resistant to my involvement, his protective instincts warring with recognition that keeping me ignorant wouldn't keep me safe. But after I correctly predicted which of his restaurant managers would accept the Calabrese family's offer based purely on behavioral cues I'd noticed during casual interactions, he began to reconsider. "You see things others miss," he admitted one evening after the children were asleep. "The way people hold themselves when they're lying, micro-expressions that betray intentions they think they're hiding. That's a valuable skill in my world, possibly more valuable than any weapon." The observation carried invitation and warning in equal measure. He was offering me a choice, a path deeper into his world that would transform me from protected civilian into something more complex and dangerous. I spent a week thinking about that choice, weighing maternal responsibilities against the growing certainty that passive protection wasn't enough. The Calabrese family wasn't going away, and neither were the next enemies who would see Mateo's attachments as vulnerabilities to exploit. I could either remain a liability requiring constant protection, or I could become an asset. Someone who contributed to our collective safety through skills I'd developed over years of reading people. The decision should have been harder than it was, but motherhood had taught me that sometimes the best way to protect your child was to become strong enough that threats thought twice before approaching. If I wanted Maya to grow up with stability and security, I needed to help Mateo maintain the power that made both possible. "I want you to teach me," I told him finally, the words carrying weight I'd only just begun to understand. "Not the violence part, that's your specialty and I don't have the stomach for it, but the strategy, the psychology, how to read situations and people well enough to spot threats before they become crises. Vincent says I have good instincts. I want to refine those instincts into actual skills." Mateo studied me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Once you start down this path, there's no going back to innocence. You'll see things that can't be unseen, learn truths that will change how you view humanity. Are you certain this is what you want?" "I'm certain that I want to protect my daughter," I replied, "and that passive waiting for someone else to keep us safe isn't good. If I'm going to live in your world, I need to understand it well enough to navigate the dangers myself." The training started slowly, Vincent teaching me to recognize surveillance techniques and suspicious behavior patterns, how to spot when someone was carrying concealed weapons based on subtle asymmetries in their movement. The way people positioned themselves relative to exits revealed whether they were victims or predators. Methods for detecting lies that went beyond simple tells, understanding baseline behaviors, and watching for deviations that suggested deception. I absorbed everything with the same dedication I'd once applied to nursing study, recognizing that my daughter's life might depend on knowledge most people would never need. Mateo contributed his own expertise, teaching me about power dynamics and organizational structure, how loyalty was earned and maintained in communities built on violence and mutual protection, the delicate balance between appearing strong enough that enemies thought twice and avoiding overreach that invited challenges to authority. Within 6 weeks, I'd become an unofficial part of Mateo's inner circle, offering insights during strategy sessions that occasionally surprised even Vincent with their accuracy. The other men in his organization were initially skeptical of my involvement, viewing me as the boss's girlfriend playing at something beyond her understanding. But skepticism transformed into cautious respect after I identified 3 potential security breach missed, reading behavioral inconsistencies in ways their violence-focused training hadn't prepared them for. Turns out that understanding human psychology was as valuable in organized crime as it was in healthcare, maybe more so when lives depended on correctly interpreting intentions and loyalties. Maya adapted to our changing circumstances with resilience that broke my heart. She'd started calling Mateo MRM with casual affection, treating him like a favorite uncle rather than her mother's employer. Luca had become the little brother she'd never had, their bond strengthening through shared experiences that included security drills disguised as games and emergency protocols, taught through stories about brave children who knew what to do when grown-ups needed help. I hated that my 6-year-old daughter could recite safe words and evacuation procedures, but I was also grateful that she'd have survival skills if the worst happened. Childhood innocence was already lost when the fire consumed our apartment. Now I was giving her tools to survive in a world that had proven itself dangerous regardless of my wishes. The Calabrese family made their official move 3 months after the photograph arrived. A meeting was arranged. Neutral ground in a restaurant owned by a family that maintained Switzerland-like neutrality in Chicago's underworld politics. Mateo was expected to come with minimal security, a show of good faith that was really just an opportunity for his enemies to assess vulnerabilities. He'd decided to bring me, a choice that Vincent had argued against, but I'd insisted upon. If the Calabrese family was building narratives about weakness, Then hiding me away would just confirm their suspicions. Better to present as a united front, showing that I was partner rather than liability, that Mateo's attachments made him more dangerous rather than less so. The restaurant was elegant, decorated in old-world style that spoke of European sensibilities transplanted to American soil. We were shown to a private dining room where three men waited with the patient confidence of predators who believed they held the advantage. Antonio Calabres was in his 50s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, carrying himself with authority earned through decades of violence and strategic brilliance. His sons flanked him, younger versions carved from the same hard material, both watching me with undisguised curiosity. "So this is the famous Sofia Carter," Antonio said, his accent thick with Italian heritage. "The woman who saved young Luca from the fire and apparently captured Chicago's most eligible bachelor's attention. You've caused quite a stir in our community, Miss Carter." I met his gaze without flinching, recognizing the test inherent in his greeting. "Mrs. Carter, actually. I'm a widow, not a miss, and I haven't caused any stir that I'm aware of. I'm just a mother trying to take care of my daughter while working for Mr. Castellano. If that bothers your community, perhaps your community has misplaced priorities." The bold response earned raised eyebrows from Antonio's sons and something that might have been amusement from the patriarch himself. "She has spirit. This one. I can see why you keep her close, Mateo. Though one wonders if the benefits outweigh the complications such an attachment creates." Mateo's hand found the small of my back, the touch both possessive and protective. "The only complication I see is people who think my personal life is subject to their assessment." "Let's dispense with pleasantries," Antonio said, settling back in his chair with casual authority. "You've been encroaching on territories we consider ours, Mateo. 3 restaurants in neighborhoods where we have established operations, undercutting our prices and poaching our staff. This behavior suggests either ignorance of boundaries or deliberate disrespect. I'm here to determine which and respond accordingly." The words were polite, but the threat beneath them was unmistakable. This meeting would determine whether the situation could be resolved diplomatically, or would escalate into open warfare that would cost lives on both sides. I watched the dynamics carefully, noting how Antonio's sons positioned themselves for optimal tactical advantage, how their eyes continuously swept the room cataloging threats and escape routes. The negotiations lasted 2 hours, a careful dance of offers and counteroffers that revealed the complexity of underworld politics. Territory wasn't just about geography, it was about respect and tradition, about maintaining structures that kept chaos from consuming everyone's businesses. Mateo eventually offered concessions that cost him little, but gave Antonio face-saving victories to bring back to his organization. The restaurants would adjust their pricing, the staff poaching would stop, and future expansion would be discussed through proper channels before implementation. In exchange, the Calabrese family would cease their intelligence gathering about Mateo's personal life and acknowledge that civilian attachments were off-limits as strategic targets. The agreement was sealed with a handshake, an implicit understanding that violations would be met with extreme prejudice. As we stood to leave, Antonio's attention focused on me one final time. "You're an unusual woman, Mrs. Carter. Most civilians who glimpse our world run screaming. You seem to be leaning in, learning our ways. That's either very brave or very foolish. I haven't decided which. Maybe it's both," I replied calmly. "But I'd rather be foolish and brave than ignorant and vulnerable. My daughter deserves a mother who can protect her from threats in whatever form they take, even if that means understanding a world most people pretend doesn't exist." Antonio nodded slowly, respect replacing the assessment in his expression. "Your mother has wisdom," he said to Maya's absence. "Teach her well, but teach her also when to walk away. Not every battle can be won, and survival sometimes means knowing which fights to avoid." The drive home was silent, both Mateo and I processing what had just happened. We'd survived the first major test of our relationship's viability in his world, proven that I could handle the pressure and politics without becoming a liability. But we'd also received a warning wrapped in Antonio's parting words. There would be battles we couldn't win, situations where even perfect strategy and loyal soldiers wouldn't be enough. The question was whether I had the judgment to recognize those situations before they consumed everyone I loved. Back at the townhouse, Maya and Luca were building another elaborate fort, their laughter echoing through rooms that felt safer now that immediate threats had been diplomatically resolved. But safety was always temporary in Mateo's world. Even as we settled into routines that felt almost normal, I knew that other enemies were watching, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to test the boundaries we'd established. The Calabrese family had been satisfied with concessions and mutual respect. The next threat might not be so reasonable. That night, after the children were asleep and Vincent's security team had taken up their positions around the property, Mateo found me standing at the window overlooking our small yard. "You were magnificent today," he said quietly. "The way you handled Antonio, meeting his challenge without backing down, but also without escalating unnecessarily. You have natural instincts for this world. That should probably worry both of us." "The worry should concern me more than it does," I admitted, turning to face him in the dim light. 6 months ago, I was a nursing assistant whose biggest concerns were making rent and affording dance classes. Now I'm negotiating with crime bosses and learning surveillance techniques like it's perfectly normal. What does that say about me as a person? That you're adaptable, Mateo said, moving closer until I could feel the heat of him through the space between us. That you prioritize survival over moral absolutes. That you love your daughter enough to become whatever she needs you to be. Those aren't character flaws, Sophia. They're strengths that most people don't develop because their lives never demand it. His hands framed my face with exquisite care, thumbs tracing patterns along my cheekbones that made my breath catch. I've been trying to maintain distance to keep this professional, despite everything between us. But after today, after watching you hold your own with Antonio Calabrese and seeing how naturally you navigate my world, I can't pretend anymore. I'm in love with you, Sophia Carter. Completely, terrifyingly in love with you in ways that make me vulnerable to every enemy I've ever made. The confession hung in the air between us, weighted with implications that went far beyond simple romantic declaration. In Mateo's world, love was currency that could be exploited, weakness that intelligent enemies would target with ruthless precision. I should tell him that this was moving too fast, that we needed to maintain boundaries for everyone's safety. Instead, I found myself pulling him closer, my hands sliding into his hair with desperate need. I love you too, I whispered against his lips, and that terrifies me more than anything your enemies could do. The kiss that followed erased months of careful restraint, all the professional distance we'd been maintaining crumbling under the weight of feelings we'd both been fighting. His hands roamed my body with reverent attention, learning curves and sensitive spots with focused dedication. When he lifted me, I wrapped my legs around his waist without hesitation, trusting him to keep us balanced as he carried me toward the bedroom I'd been occupying alone since moving into the townhouse. What followed was tender and desperate in equal measure. Two people who'd been denying themselves finally giving in to needs that went beyond physical desire. Mateo made love to me like I was something precious that might shatter if he wasn't careful. His touch gentle, despite the strength I could feel coiled beneath his control. I traced the scars that decorated his body. Evidence of violence survived and battles won, each mark telling stories he'd probably never fully share. When we finally collapsed together, both breathless and satisfied, I felt something shift fundamentally in my chest. This wasn't just about attraction or convenience anymore. This was partnership forged in fire and sealed in trust that transcended rational calculation. The next morning brought complications I should have anticipated. Maya found Mateo making breakfast in the kitchen, his presence at 7 in the morning carrying implications even a 6-year-old could interpret. Her eyes went wide, darting between us with the kind of assessment children employed when their world was shifting in ways they couldn't quite articulate. "Is Marma staying for breakfast?" she asked carefully, like the answer would determine something important about her future. "Staying for more than just breakfast," I said. Deciding honesty was better than trying to maintain fictions she'd see through immediately. "Mr. Mateo and I care about each other very much, and that means we're going to be spending more time together. Is that okay with you?" Maya considered this with the seriousness she applied to all major decisions. "Does this mean Luca is going to be here more too? Because I like having him around. He's like the little brother I always wanted." The casual acceptance, focused more on gaining a sibling than on her mother's romantic choices, made my heart clench with relief and love. "Yes, baby. Luca's going to be around a lot more. We're becoming a family, 4 of us. That okay with you?" Maya nodded solemnly, then launched herself at Mateo with the same enthusiasm she showed when particularly excited. "You're going to be my maybe someday stepdad," she announced, wrapping her arms around his waist. "That means you have to come to my dance recital next month and cheer really loud when I do my solo." Mateo caught my eye over Maya's dark curls, his expression carrying surprised pleasure at her ready acceptance. "I wouldn't miss it for anything," he promised, hugging her back with the same gentle care he showed Luca. "You'll have to teach me the proper protocols for dance recital attendant. Do I need to bring flowers? Is there a dress code?" Maya giggled, the sound bright and uncomplicated in ways that reminded me why I'd fought so hard to give her stability. "You just have to be there and be proud of me. That's all I need." The simplicity of her requirements, the basic human need to be witnessed and valued by the people she loved, made me realize how much we'd both been missing during the years we'd struggled alone. Mateo offered something I'd stopped believing was possible, a partner who would share burdens and celebrate victories, who would stand beside me rather than demanding I change to accommodate his needs. The weeks that followed established new rhythms that felt like the family structure I'd once thought existed only in television sitcoms. Mateo moved more of his belongings into the townhouse, transforming it from temporary refuge to permanent home. Luca transitioned to living with us full-time, his room decorated with the same care Maya's had received. The children adapted with the resilience that seemed universal among those who'd already learned that stability was something to be cherished rather than assumed. They created their own routines, weekend movie nights where they took turns choosing films, elaborate art projects that covered every available surface, the kind of sibling rivalry that was really just another form of love expressed through competitive game playing and strategic toy borrowing. Vincent continued his security training but now included Maya in age-appropriate ways. She learned about stranger danger and what to do if someone tried to take her. Emergency protocols disguised as games that would hopefully never be necessary but provided crucial skills if the worst happened. Luca received similar instruction, both children developing awareness that most their age never needed. It should have been tragic, stealing innocence to teach survival, but I consoled myself with the knowledge that innocence had already been compromised by the fire and its aftermath. Now I was just giving them tools to navigate the dangerous world we'd found ourselves occupying. Business pressures increased as Matteo's organization continued expanding. More restaurants opened, each requiring careful negotiation with existing power structures to avoid conflicts like the one with the Calabrese family. I found myself increasingly involved in these negotiations, my ability to read people proving valuable in situations where misunderstanding intentions could be fatal. Other families began requesting my presence at meetings, recognizing that I brought perspective their male-dominated organizations lacked. Women were often underestimated in the underworld, dismissed as decorative accessories rather than strategic assets. That underestimation gave me advantages, allowed me to observe and analyze while men focused on traditional power displays and territorial posturing. 6 months after that first night together, Matteo proposed, not with grand gestures or public declarations, but privately in the kitchen where we'd first acknowledged our feeling. He presented a ring that had belonged to his mother, explaining that in his family, such heirlooms were only offered to women intended to become permanent parts of the lineage. The tradition carried weight I was only beginning to understand. Acceptance into a world that valued blood ties and sworn loyalties above all else. Marrying Matteo meant more than legal union. It meant becoming part of an organization that would protect me absolutely, but also expect loyalty that transcended conventional morality. I said yes without hesitation, recognizing that I'd already crossed every line that might have given me pause months earlier. The engagement party was held at Matteo's flagship restaurant, attended by allies and associates who needed to witness the official integration of Sofia Carter into the Castellano family structure. I wore a dress Matteo had commissioned, elegant without being ostentatious, chosen to present his partner rather than trophy. The evening was carefully choreographed, introductions to people whose names I'd studied but never met, conversations that were really negotiations about future alliances and territorial boundaries. Antonio Calabrese attended with his son, offering congratulations that seemed genuine despite our complicated history. "You chose well," he told Matteo while I stood beside them. "She has strength and wisdom that will serve your family for generations. May your union be blessed with children who inherit the best of both parents." The blessing carried weight in their world, acknowledgement that our relationship had been formally accepted by power structures that could have made life impossibly complicated if they'd chosen opposition instead. Other families followed Antonio's lead, offering gifts and goodwill that solidified our position while creating obligations we'd need to honor through future reciprocity. By the evening's end, I'd been transformed from Matteo's girlfriend into his fiancée, from civilian under protection into family member with status and responsibilities of my own. The change should have felt more significant than it did, but really, I'd been operating as family since that first security meeting when Vincent recognized my value. The engagement just made official what everyone had already accepted as inevitable. Maya and Luca served as unofficial ambassadors, charming everyone with their easy affection and unself-conscious joy. People softened around children, even hardened criminals whose business involved violence found themselves smiling at childish enthusiasm. Our children became bridges between worlds, proof that humanity existed even in communities built on power and strategic ruthlessness. Watching them work the room with innocent manipulation, I felt pride mixed with sadness at how much they'd already learned about navigating complex social dynamics. They deserved carefree childhoods focused on play and imagination, not strategic relationship building with organized crime fam. Later that night, after guests had departed and children were sleeping off the excitement of staying up past bedtime, Matteo found me on the terrace overlooking the city lights. "You're having second thoughts," he observed quietly, reading my contemplative silence with the accuracy that had become familiar. "Not about marrying me, but about the world you've agreed to inhabit permanently." "I'm thinking about Maya and Luca," I admitted. "About the lives we're giving them, the things they're learning that children shouldn't need to know. I want them to have security and stability, but not at the cost of their innocence. Is it possible to give them both? Or does surviving in your world require sacrificing one for the other?" Matteo's arms wrapped around me from behind, his chin resting on my shoulder as we both studied the city that held such beauty and danger. "I don't know," he said honestly. My own childhood was divided between legitimate facade and brutal reality. I learned early that the world wasn't safe, that power mattered more than justice, that family loyalty transcended laws written by people who'd never faced our kind of dangers. Those lessons served me well, made me strong enough to protect the people I love, but they also cost me something I can't quite name, some essential softness that might have made me a better person. The threat came from an unexpected direction 3 weeks before our scheduled wedding, not from rival families or disgruntled associates, but from the legitimate world I'd left behind when I'd entered Matteo's. A social worker named Patricia Brennan appeared at the townhouse one Tuesday morning, credentials identifying her as part of of Chicago's Child Protective Services Division. Her smile was professional and sympathetic as she explained that someone had filed a complaint about Maya's living situation, allegations that I was exposing my daughter to dangerous individuals in unsuitable environments. Anonymous tips suggested involvement with organized crime figures. Claims that my employment with Mateo Castellano put Maya at risk of witnessing violence or being used as leverage in criminal enterprises. The accusations were carefully crafted, mixing enough truth with strategic exaggeration to create legitimate concerns that CPS was obligated to investigate. Patricia needed to conduct interviews with Maya, assess our living conditions, and review my financial records to ensure I hadn't obtained resources through illegal means. The investigation would take weeks, possibly months, during which time Maya's custody status would be under review. She didn't say it directly, but the implication was clear. If I couldn't prove that my daughter was safe and well cared for despite my association with Mateo, they could remove her from my custody pending further investigation. The threat was more effective than any violence could have been, targeting the one thing I valued more than my own life. I maintained composure through Patricia's initial visit, answering questions with careful honesty that revealed nothing about Mateo's business beyond his legitimate restaurant operations. Yes, I worked for Mr. Castellano as a nanny for his son. Yes, we were engaged to be married. No, I had never witnessed anything that would concern child welfare authorities. Yes, our home was secure with appropriate safety measures. The security personnel were employed by Mateo's business interests, standard practice for someone of his wealth and prominence. Everything I said was technically true while omitting the context that would confirm their worst suspicions. Patricia left with promises to return for follow-up visits, her expression suggesting she knew I was hiding something but couldn't quite prove what. Mateo arrived home to find me sitting at the kitchen table, the business card Patricia had left clutched in my trembling hands. One look at my face told him everything he needed to know. What happened? Who threatened you? When I explained about CPS and the anonymous complaint, his expression transformed into something I'd never seen before. Cold rage mixed with calculation, the strategic mind that had built his empire immediately analyzing threats and identifying solutions. Someone's playing a different game, he said quietly. They can't touch us directly because Antonia would interpret that as treaty violation. So they're using the system, turning legitimate authorities into weapons they can wield while maintaining plausible deniability. Vincent was summoned along with two other men whose expertise lay in information gathering, rather than physical enforcement. Within 6 hours, they'd identified 3 possible sources for the anonymous complaint. A disgruntled employee from one of Mateo's restaurants who'd been fired for theft, a low-level associate in the Calabrese organization who'd been vocal about disagreeing with Antonio's peaceful resolution, and a journalist named Marcus Webb who'd been investigating organized crime connections in Chicago's restaurant industry for the past 18 months. Each had means and motive to cause trouble, but only one had the sophistication to understand that attacking through CPS would be more effective than direct confrontation. Webb was the problem, Vincent confirmed after reviewing the journalist's recent activities. He's been building a story about corruption and criminal infiltration of legitimate businesses. It has sources in multiple agencies including CPS. The anonymous complaint probably came from him, manufactured to create the investigation he needs to justify deeper digging into your finances and Mateo's operations. If he can prove that Maya lives in a household supported by criminal enterprise, it gives him the angle he needs to publish accusations we can't easily refute. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity, using my love for my daughter as the pressure point that would force either cooperation or incriminating overreaction. We can't make him disappear, I said, reading the looks being exchanged between Mateo and his associates. That's your first instinct, I know. But killing a journalist investigating organized crime would confirm everything he suspects and bring attention we can't afford. We need a different approach, something that neutralizes the threat without creating new problems. The men looked skeptical, accustomed to solving problems through force rather than strategy. But Mateo studied me with renewed focus, recognizing that my perspective offered options his training hadn't prepared him to see. What do you have in mind? I spent the next 3 days researching Marcus Webb with the same intensity I'd once applied to studying for nursing exams. His background, his previous stories, the patterns of investigation that had made him successful enough to be considered threatening. What I discovered was a man driven by genuine moral conviction rather than personal vendetta or career ambition. Webb believed in exposing corruption, in protecting communities from exploitation by powerful criminals who hid behind legitimate facades. He wasn't our enemy in any personal sense. He was just someone whose definition of justice required destroying exactly what Mateo had built. Understanding that difference was crucial to finding a solution that didn't involve violence. The meeting I arranged was in a coffee shop far from any territory Mateo controlled, neutral ground where Webb might feel safe enough to actually listen. He arrived skeptical but curious, recognizing that my request for private conversations suggested an unusual approach to his investigation. You're trying to protect your daughter, he said without preamble. I understand that instinct, but you must also understand that exposing your fiancé's criminal connections is my job. Regardless of the personal cost to innocent parties like Maya, she deserves better than being raised in a household funded by illegal activities. The moral certainty in his voice reminded me of my own convictions before fire and circumstance had forced me to recognize that morality was more complicated than simple absolutes. You're right that she deserves better, I agreed. Every child does, but taking her away from the only stable home she's known since her father abandoned us won't improve her life. It will just traumatize her again. Teach her that security is always temporary, and love always comes with conditions. I paused, gathering courage for the gamble I was about to take. What if I could give you a better story? One that exposes real corruption without destroying my family in the process. Webb's expression sharpened with journalist instinct, recognizing potential breakthrough. What kind of story? The kind that involves city officials taking bribes to ignore health code violations in restaurants owned by the Moretti family. Documentation of money laundering through construction contracts awarded to politically connected developers. Evidence of police officers providing protection to drug distribution networks in exchange for cash. I watched his eyes widen as I laid out information Vincent had helped me compile. Criminal activities by organizations that weren't protected by Mateo's treaties or connected to our operations. Real corruption that Webb could expose without touching the Castellano family interests. The catch was obvious even before he asked, "Why would you give me this? What do you want in exchange?" "I want you to drop the investigation into my daughter's living situation," I said simply. "Except that while Mateo Castellano may not be a saint, he's also not the monster you're imagining. His restaurants are legitimate businesses that employ hundreds of people and serve their communities well. Whatever else he might be involved in doesn't impact Maya's safety or well-being. She's loved, protected, thriving in ways she never could have when I was working 3 jobs just to make rent." Webb studied me for a long moment, journalist training warring with human compassion. "You're asking me to compromise my investigation based on your personal circumstances. That's not how journalism is supposed to work. I'm asking you to recognize that not every story worth telling requires destroying innocent lives," I countered. "You can expose corruption and protect communities without using my 6-year-old daughter as collateral damage against organized crime. The information I'm offering is solid, documented, it will make your career and actually help people. All I'm asking is that you leave my family alone in exchange." The negotiation took another hour, Webb pushing back on details and demanding proof that the information I was offering was legitimate rather than manufactured evidence designed to discredit his investigation. I provided documents Vincent had acquired through means I preferred not to examine too closely, evidence that would stand up to journalistic scrutiny and potentially lead to actual criminal prosecutions. By the time we parted, I had Webb's agreement to drop the CPS complaint and redirect his investigation toward targets I'd identified. The cost was information that would destroy several careers and possibly lead to prison sentences for people who'd thought themselves protected by political connection. I tried not to think about the human consequences of what I'd just done, focusing instead on the fact that Maya was safe and our wedding could proceed without CPS threatening to remove her from my custody. Mateo was furious when I explained what I'd done, not because I'd failed, but because I'd succeeded using methods he couldn't control or protect me from. "You took a massive risk meeting with Webb alone. What if he'd been wearing a wire? What if he uses your statements as evidence?" The concern in his voice was justified, but I'd been careful to phrase everything in hypotheticals and avoid any admission that legally. I gave him corruption from families you don't have treaties with, information that hurts your enemies more than your allies, and I did it without violence, without creating martyrs or investigations that would never end. Isn't that what you wanted? Someone who could navigate your world using strategy instead of force? His anger transformed into something that looked like pride mixed with fear. "You're becoming more dangerous than any soldier I employ," he said quietly. "That's exactly what I was afraid of, that loving me would change you into someone you never intended to be." "I'm becoming someone who can protect her family," I corrected. Maybe that wasn't who I intended to be 6 months ago, but intentions don't matter nearly as much as results. Maya is safe. Webb has a story that will make his career, and we get to plan our wedding without threats hanging over our heads. That's a win regardless of how we arrived at it. The wedding took place on a Saturday afternoon in early autumn, the kind of perfect day that felt like blessing from whatever forces governed the universe. Maya served as flower girl with Luca as ring bearer, both children taking their responsibilities with adorable seriousness that made even hardened criminals smile. The ceremony itself was small, limited to family and closest associates, in the private garden behind Mateo's flagship restaurant. Antonio Calabrese attended along with representatives from other families, their presence serving as official acknowledgement that my integration into the Castellano organization was complete and permanent. Vincent stood as Mateo's best man, his approval of our union carrying weight that transcended traditional wedding party roles. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to the marriage, the silence was absolute and weighted with meanings that went far beyond romantic comedy tropes. In Mateo's world, objecting to this union would have been tantamount to declaring war. and no one present was prepared to take that step. The vows we exchanged were traditional on the surface, but carried implications unique to our circumstance. Promising to love and cherish in good times and bad meant acknowledging that bad times might involve violence and danger most couples never faced. Promising to forsake all others meant pledging loyalty that extended beyond romantic fidelity into organizational commitment that superseded previous allegiances. The reception that followed transformed the restaurant into something magical. Fairy lights strung through the garden, creating atmosphere that made even the most dangerous men present relax into celebration. Maya and Luca danced with abandon, their laughter infectious enough that other guests joined them on the makeshift dance floor. They watched from Mateo's arms, swaying to music that felt like promise of futures we'd fought to make possible. This was family in the truest sense, not just blood relations, but chosen bonds forged through shared struggle and mutual protection. The people surrounding us had witnessed our journey from rescue through fire to this moment of formal union, and their presence carried blessing that mattered more than any official ceremony could provide. Antonio Calabrese approached as the evening wound down, his sons flanking him in formation that had become familiar through months of diplomatic interaction. "You've built something remarkable here," he said, gesturing to encompass not just the wedding but everything it represented. Family that bridges legitimate and illegitimate worlds. A woman who understands power without being corrupted by it. Children who will grow up knowing both sides of our reality. My father used to say that the strongest organizations were built on love as much as fear. I never understood what he told tonight. The compliment carried weight beyond simple wedding congratulations. Antonio was acknowledging that Mateo's decision to openly claim me and Maya's family had strengthened rather than weakened his position. Other families watched to see if attachment would create vulnerability to exploit. Instead, they'd witness strategic partnership that enhanced capabilities rather than creating liabilities. I'd proven valuable not despite being civilian, but because civilian perspective offered insights their violence-focused training had never developed. Women in their world were usually relegated to supportive roles, managing households and raising children while men conducted business. I'd carved out space that was neither traditionally feminine nor masculine, becoming advisor and strategist whose gender was less relevant than the results I produced. The honeymoon was necessarily brief, just 3 days at a private estate in the countryside where security could be maintained while providing illusion of escape from daily pressure. Maya and Luca stayed with Vincent, whose unexpected tenderness with children had made him their favorite among Mateo's associates. The time away allowed breathing room to process how much our lives had transformed since that Tuesday evening when fire had consumed my old apartment and forced me into Mateo's orbit. We talked about the future during long walks through autumn woods that reminded me of childhood before loss and hardship had reshaped my expectations. Mateo wanted more children, siblings for Luca and Maya who would grow up in the stability we'd fought to create. I wanted to return to school, to finally pursue the medical degree I'd abandoned when pregnancy and single motherhood had reordered my priorities. "We can do both," Mateo insisted when I suggested these goals might be incompatible. "You've proven capable of managing complexity most people wouldn't attempt. Balancing family and education and your role in my organization isn't beyond your abilities. Besides, having a physician in the family would be strategically valuable. Discreet medical care is always in demand in our world." The observation was pragmatic rather than romantic, but I'd learned that in Mateo's world, practicality was its own form of love. He showed care through ensuring I had resources to pursue dreams, through planning futures that accommodated my ambitions rather than requiring I sacrifice them for his convenience. Returning home brought us back to reality with all its complications and daily demands. Patricia Brennan had closed her investigation after Marcus Webb withdrew his complaint, her final report noting that Maya was thriving in a stable, loving environment with appropriate supervision and resources. The journalist had published his expose on municipal corruption 2 weeks after our conversation, the story generating enough attention that several officials faced criminal charges while others resigned to avoid prosecution. Webb never mentioned Mateo's organization or our family, honoring his agreement with professionalism I'd hoped for but hadn't entirely trusted. His success validated my approach, proving that strategic thinking could accomplish what violence never could. Problems didn't always require force. Sometimes they just required understanding motivations and offering alternatives that satisfied everyone's core needs. Life settled into rhythms that felt remarkably normal despite the abnormal circumstances that had created our family structure. Maya started second grade at a private school where her classmates came from families wealthy enough that our lifestyle didn't seem unusual. She made friends easily, her natural warmth drawing children who might otherwise have been isolated by their parents' wealth. Luca began kindergarten at the same institution, his serious demeanor softening as he learned to trust that this stability was permanent rather than temporary. Both children thrived in ways that justified every compromise I'd made to give them security. I enrolled in pre-medical courses at the local university, studying during hours when children were at school, and Mateo was managing business interests. The workload was intense, but no more challenging than the years I'd worked multiple jobs while raising Maya alone. Vincent continued my education in areas the university didn't cover, teaching me about organizational security and strategic planning that would serve me whether I became a physician or continued evolving into whatever role the family required. The dual education felt appropriate for life that straddled legitimate and illegitimate worlds, preparing me to navigate both with equal competence. Mateo's organization continued expanding, restaurants opening in new cities and creating legitimate employment for communities that needed economic development. Not all his business was legal, I knew that, and had made peace with the knowledge, but increasing portions of his empire operated within law's boundaries. He was building something that could eventually transition fully legitimate, a legacy that Luca and Maya could inherit without the stigma that had marked previous generations. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight, but progress was being made toward futures where our children wouldn't need to choose between family loyalty and personal morality. 1 year after the fire that had destroyed my old life, we returned to the Riverside apartment site. The building had been demolished, replaced by new construction that bore no resemblance to the place where I'd once struggled to make rent. Standing in that parking lot watching Maya and Luca play in the adjacent park, I tried to reconcile the woman I'd been with the woman I'd become. 12 months earlier, I'd been terrified and alone, convinced that survival meant accepting limitations I could never transcend. Running into that burning building had been pure instinct, maternal desperation to save a child regardless of personal risk. I hadn't known that single act of courage would completely reshape my existence. Would you do it again? Mateo asked quietly, reading my contemplative silence with the accuracy that had become familiar. If you could go back to that Tuesday evening knowing everything that would follow, would you still run into the fire? I considered the question seriously, thinking about all the complications and compromises that had followed. The violence I'd witnessed, the moral flexibility I'd developed, the ways I'd become complicit in activities I'd once condemned from comfortable distance. But I also thought about Maya's laughter as she played with the little brother she'd always wanted, about Luca's transformation from a grieving child into someone confident and loved, about Mateo himself, the way he looked at me like I was something precious that he'd protect with his dying breath. Yes, I said simply, do it all again. Not because the path was easy or because I don't sometimes question the choices I've made, but because this family we've built, this life we're creating together, it matters more than the innocence I lost along the way. Maya deserves the stability we're giving her. Luca deserves a mother figure who won't abandon him. And you deserve someone who sees all of you, the good and the complicated and the dangerous, and loves you anyway. Mateo's arms wrapped around me from behind, his chin resting on my shoulder as we both watched our children play in afternoon sunlight that felt like blessing. You're the bravest person I've ever known, he said quietly. Not because you ran into fire, though that took courage most people don't possess, but because you keep choosing this life every day despite having countless reasons to walk away. That kind of sustained bravery is rarer than momentary heroism. The observation settled over me with unexpected weight. He was right that staying required different courage than the split-second decision to enter a burning building. Every day I chose this life was another small act of faith that we could build something good despite the foundations of violence and moral compromise. Every day I worked to give our children stability was another incremental victory against the chaos that had defined my earlier life. The accumulation of small choices, daily commitments to family and future, that was the real heroism. Not the dramatic gesture, but the sustained dedication to something larger than individual survival. We stayed in that park until evening, letting the children play until exhaustion made them actually willing to go home without protest. During the drive back to the townhouse that was now legally mine as well as Mateo's, I reflected on how much had changed and how much remained constant. I was still a mother trying to give her daughter the best possible life, still someone who valued loyalty and honesty even when circumstances made those virtues complicated. Still fundamentally myself, despite the ways Mateo's world had reshaped my understanding of morality and power. That night, after children were asleep and the house had settled into comfortable quiet, I found Mateo in his study reviewing reports from various business interests. He looked up as I entered, expressions softening in ways reserved for private moments. "Come here," he said, pulling me into his lap with gentle insistence. "I have something for you." The envelope he produced contained documents I'd been waiting months to receive. My acceptance letter to medical school, full scholarship covering tuition and expenses, with a stipulation that I could attend part-time to accommodate family responsibility. Mateo had been working behind the scenes to make this possible, using connections and resources to open doors that would have remained closed to a single mother with my background. "You did this," I said, reading through the acceptance letter with hands that trembled slightly. "You made this happen." "We did this together," he corrected. "You earned it through hard work and determination. I just removed some obstacles that would have made the path unnecessarily difficult. That's what family does. So we lift each other up, remove barriers, create opportunities that wouldn't exist if we were facing the world alone." His arms tightened around me and I felt tears sliding down my cheeks despite my effort to maintain composure. These were happy tears, though, the kind that came from realizing dreams you'd convinced yourself were impossible. The future stretched before us, uncertain in its details but solid in its foundation. There would be challenges, I knew, new threats from enemies I hadn't yet identified and complications I couldn't predict, but we'd face them together. This family forged in fire and sealed in love that transcended conventional boundaries. Maya would grow up strong and educated, with opportunities I'd never had and security I'd fought to provide. Luca would have the mother he'd lost too young, someone who loved him as fiercely as she loved her biological daughter. And Matteo, my complicated, dangerous, devoted husband, would continue building an empire that balanced legitimate success with whatever shadows his past required him to maintain. We were an unlikely family by any measure, a former nursing assistant, a crime boss, and 2 children who deserved better than the world's harsh realities. But we were also proof that courage came in many forms, that love could flourish in unexpected places, and that sometimes the most important thing you could do was run toward the fire instead of away from it. Whatever came next, whatever challenges awaited us in the years ahead, we would face them the way we'd faced everything since that Tuesday evening, when smoke detectors had announced the end of my old life. Together with strategic thinking and unwavering commitment to protecting the people we loved, the fire had taken everything I owned but given me everything that mattered. And standing in Matteo's arms while our children slept safely in rooms decorated with love and care, I couldn't regret a single choice that had brought us to this moment. This was home. This was family. This was exactly where I belonged.